The Galactic Council chamber had witnessed many historic moments in its 3,000-year existence, but nothing quite like what unfolded on Station Day 2847 of the Terran calendar. The vast amphitheater, carved from a single asteroid and polished to mirror perfection, housed representatives from over 400 species. Each delegate sat within their atmospheric containment fields, creating a stunning mosaic of alien life forms that had taken millennia to unite under one governing body. At the center of this grandeur stood General Vextherin Kolthes, Supreme Commander of the Hegemony war machine and, arguably the most feared military strategist in known space. His 12-foot frame was encased in ceremonial battle armor that bore the scars of 100 conquered worlds. Forearms ending in razor-sharp talons gestured as he spoke, while his compound eyes surveyed the assembled delegates with the cold calculation of a predator. The translation matrix rendered his guttural war speech into something approaching diplomacy, though the underlying menace remained unmistakable. Honored delegates, Vextherin's voice resonated through the chamber like distant thunder. Today marks the 15th anniversary of humanity's integration into our galactic community. 15 years since these bipedal mammals were granted the extraordinary privilege of participating in civilized discourse alongside their betters. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The hegemony's tolerance for the newest spacefaring species had always been grudging at best. Most delegates remembered the fierce debates surrounding humanity's admission to the Council. The humans had barely developed faster-than-light travel, possessed no significant military might, and controlled only one star system. By every traditional metric, they were decades away from qualifying for Council membership. Yet in these 15 years, Vextherin continued, his mandibles clicking with what might have been amusement among his kind. What contributions have they made to galactic civilization? Where are their grand achievements? Their technological marvels? Their military victories? Ambassador Chen Weilin, humanity's senior representative, remains seated in the Terran delegation box. At 63, she had spent the better part of 2 decades navigating the treacherous currents of galactic politics. Her weathered features betrayed no emotion as Vextherin's words washed over her, though her fingers gripped the armrest of her chair with white-knuckled intensity. I propose, Vextherin declared, his voice building to what could only be described as a war cry, that humanity has enjoyed long enough the charity of this council. They consume resources that could be better allocated to species that have proven their worth. They occupy territories that more advanced civilizations could develop properly. Most egregiously, they presume to vote on matters far beyond their primitive comprehension. The chamber erupted. Delegates from the Crystalline Confederacy chimed in harmonious agreement, their silicon-based forms shimmering with approval. The Void Swimmers, entities of living shadow, darkened their containment fields in what their species considered enthusiastic support. Even some of humanity's traditional allies seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Therefore, Vextherin raised one of his primary arms for silence. I invoke the ancient right of challenge of worth. Let humanity prove they deserve their place among us, or let them relinquish it to species more deserving. Ambassador Chen finally stood, her human height making her appear almost childlike next to the towering aliens surrounding her. General Vextherin, she said, her voice carrying despite its comparative softness, humanity accepts your challenge. Name your terms. What happened next would be debated by xenobiologists and military historians for generations. Vextherin's compound eyes focused entirely on the human delegation, his predator's instincts perhaps recognizing something his conscious mind had missed. The terms are simple, he announced. Single combat. One warrior from your species against one from mine. A contest of strength, strategy, and will. Victory determines humanity's future in this council. And, if we refuse? Chen asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Then, you forfeit by default, and humanity's council membership is revoked immediately. Your species will be relocated to reservations where you can develop at your own pace without troubling your betters. The euphemism fooled no one. Relocation in hegemony parlance typically meant forced labor colonies on mining worlds or agricultural planets where lifespans were measured in brutal years rather than comfortable decades. Chen nodded slowly. We accept. However, the ancient texts require that the challenged party choose their champion. We reserve that right. Granted, Vextheron replied with what sounded like amusement. Choose your greatest warrior, human. Send your finest soldier, your most accomplished general. Send whoever you believe has the slightest chance of providing entertainment before their inevitable defeat. What occurred next sent shock waves through the galactic political establishment that would reverberate for decades. Ambassador Chin did not call for Admiral Harrison, humanity's most decorated military commander. She did not summon General Rodriguez, hero of the Mars Rebellion. She did not even request Colonel Thompson, the legendary Special Forces operative whose exploits were whispered about in intelligence circles across 12 star systems. Instead, she pressed a communication key and spoke a single name, Sarah Chen Martinez. The confused murmur that arose from the assembled delegates was unlike anything the translators had ever processed. In over 400 languages, the sentiment was the same: who was Sarah Chen Martinez? Vextheron's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation among his species. I am unfamiliar with this warrior. What are her achievements? What campaigns has she led? What enemies has she conquered? Ambassador Chen's expression revealed nothing as she replied, Sarah Chen Martinez is my great-granddaughter. She is 19 years old. She has never served in any military capacity, led any campaigns, or conquered any enemies. She is, by any traditional measure, completely unremarkable. The silence that followed was so profound that the ambient hum of the station's life support systems became audible. Even the usually chattering Gossamer collective fell quiet, their telepathic network apparently overwhelmed by the sheer incomprehensibility of what they had just witnessed. Vextheron's 12-foot frame seemed to expand with outrage. You mock the sacred ritual. You insult the traditions of combat that have governed civilized species since before your sun ignited. Not at all, Chan replied calmly. The ancient texts specify that the challenged party may choose their champion. They place no restrictions on age, experience, or qualifications. We choose Sarah Chen Martinez. A child? Vextheron's voice rose to a pitch that caused several smaller species to activate their hearing protection. You send a child to face the supreme commander of the hegemony war machine? Sarah is legally an adult by human standards, Chen clarified. She meets all requirements for serving as our champion. The political calculations were already being made across the chamber. If humanity chose a child as their champion, their defeat would be so overwhelming, so humiliating, that it would serve as an object lesson to any other species that might question hegemony supremacy. Vextheron would not merely win, he would demonstrate the vast gulf between evolved military cultures and primitive newcomers. Or so everyone thought. The transport bay doors opened with a hydraulic hiss that echoed through the now silent chamber. What emerged would have been completely unremarkable in any human context but appeared almost alien in the grandeur of the Galactic Council. Sarah Chen Martinez stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with shoulder-length black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore standard civilian clothing, dark jeans, a white t-shirt, and worn running shoes. Her mixed heritage was evident in her features, combining her great-grandmother's East Asian ancestry with Latino lineage that gave her warm brown eyes and olive-toned skin. She carried nothing that could be mistaken for a weapon. No armor adorned her frame. She bore no visible scars from battles fought or medals from victories won. To the assembled aliens, she appeared to be exactly what she was, a human teenager who had been summoned from whatever ordinary life she had been living and thrust into a situation that would determine the fate of her entire species. Yet as Sarah walked across the polished floor of the chamber, something indefinable shifted in the atmosphere. Vextheron, master of psychological warfare, found himself studying her gait with the attention he usually reserved for analyzing enemy battle formations. There was something in the way she moved, not arrogant, not swaggering, but with a quiet confidence that seemed completely at odds with her circumstances. Are you Sarah Chen Martinez? Vextheron inquired, his voice automatically adjusting to what his species considered appropriate for addressing inferiors. I am, Sarah replied. Her voice carried easily through the chamber despite its lack of amplification. There was no tremor of fear, no hesitation in the face of a being that stood twice her height and possessed enough physical strength to tear her apart without effort. Do you understand what you face here, child?
Do you comprehend the forces arrayed against you? Sarah looked up at Vex Theron with an expression of mild curiosity.
I understand that you've challenged my species to prove our worth through single combat.
I understand that if I fail, my people will be enslaved or worse.
I understand that you're considered the greatest military strategist in known space and that you've never been defeated in battle.
Then, you also understand, Vex Theron said, his compound eyes gleaming with what might have been satisfaction, that you cannot possibly win. Sarah's response would be quoted in philosophical texts for centuries afterward. General, the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. The question isn't whether I can win. The question is whether you can.
The implications of her words were lost on most of the assembled delegates, but Vex Theron felt something he had not experienced in decades: uncertainty. This human child was not behaving according to any predictable pattern. She showed no bravado, no false courage, no desperate speeches about fighting for her people. Instead, she spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had already fought and won the only battle that truly mattered.
Explain yourself, Vex Theron demanded.
You stand there believing you're the pinnacle of military evolution, Sarah said, her tone remaining conversational despite the cosmic stakes.
But, you've made a fundamental error in your assessment. You think this is a contest between your strength and mine, your experience against my inexperience, your weapons versus my empty hands.
She gestured around the chamber, taking in the hundreds of alien spectators and the weight of civilizations watching.
But that's not what this is at all. This is a contest between your version of strength and an entirely different kind of strength that you don't even recognize exists. What strength could you possibly possess that I lack?
Vex Theron's voice carried the patronizing tone of an adult humoring a child's fantasies. The strength that comes from having nothing left to prove, Sarah replied. You see, General, you've spent your entire existence building an image of yourself as invincible. Every victory, every conquest, every defeated enemy has been another brick in the wall of your identity. You are Vex Theron, the undefeated, terror of the void, supreme commander who has never known failure. Her words cut through the chamber like a blade.
But, I'm just Sarah. I'm nobody special. I haven't spent decades building a reputation that can be destroyed by a single loss.
I haven't constructed my entire sense of self around being stronger than everyone else. I have nothing to lose here except my life, and that's a freedom you'll never understand. The psychological warfare had begun, and, somehow, impossibly, the 19-year-old human had seized the initiative from one of the galaxy's most feared military minds.
Vex Theron's mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed this unexpected development.
In all his centuries of combat, he had faced enemies who tried to intimidate him with their strength, outwit him with their strategy, or overwhelm him with their technology. He had never faced someone who seemed genuinely unconcerned with the outcome. Combat parameters, he announced, his voice carrying a slight edge that his species' vocal cords had never been designed to produce.
Hand-to-hand combat within the designated arena.
No weapons save those we carry naturally.
Contest continues until one participant yields, is incapacitated, or...
He paused meaningfully, dies. Agreed, Sarah said without hesitation.
The arena materialized around them as the chamber's holographic systems activated.
It was a simple space, 50 meters square with a raised platform that would give all delegates an unobstructed view. The floor was marked with traditional combat circles used by dozens of species throughout galactic history. As they took their positions at opposite ends of the arena, the contrast could not have been more stark. Vex Theron began the ritual preparations of his warrior caste, flexing his forearms and extending his natural claws while his auxiliary breathing organs cycled to their combat configuration.
His 12-foot frame cast a shadow that seemed to engulf half the arena.
Sarah, meanwhile, sat down cross-legged on the arena floor and closed her eyes. The gesture was so unexpected, so seemingly inappropriate, that several delegates actually activated their translation matrices multiple times, certain they were missing some crucial context. In every warrior culture represented in the chamber, the pre-combat period was dedicated to intimidation displays, weapon preparation, or strategic positioning. No one simply sat down and meditated.
"What are you doing?" Vex Theron demanded.
Remembering who I used to be, Sarah replied without opening her eyes.
And, saying goodbye to her. The cryptic response further unsettled the general.
Throughout his career, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read his opponents, to understand their motivations and predict their tactics.
This human girl was unlike anything in his experience.
She seemed to exist in a state of calm that bordered on the transcendent.
I don't understand your strategy, Vextheron said, and the admission felt like swallowing glass.
Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him with something that might have been compassion.
That's because you think this is about strategy.
But some battles can't be won through superior tactics or greater strength.
Some battles can only be won by being willing to lose everything.
She stood gracefully, and something had changed in her bearing. The casual teenager was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to carry the weight of profound understanding.
You ask me what strength I possess that you lack. Here's the answer: I've already defeated the person I was before I walked into this chamber. I've destroyed every weak thought, every doubt, every fear that might hold me back.
The girl who was afraid of failing her people, of dying young, of not being enough, she's gone. What stands here now is someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The combat began not with a charge or a battle cry, but with Sarah simply walking toward Vextheron at a steady, unhurried pace. The general, trained in hundreds of forms of combat from across the galaxy, found himself momentarily paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of her approach. Every instinct told him this was a trap, that she must have some hidden weapon or strategy, but his sensors detected nothing beyond an unarmed human moving with the casual confidence of someone taking a stroll through a park. When she was 10 feet away, Vextheron's warrior programming finally overrode his confusion. He lunged forward with a speed that had overwhelmed countless opponents, his forearms working in perfect coordination to deliver strikes that could crush titanium. To the observers, it appeared as though Sarah would be torn apart in milliseconds. Instead, something impossible happened. Sarah moved. It wasn't the fluid grace of a martial artist or the calculated precision of a soldier. It was something entirely different, a kind of movement that seemed to flow around Vextheron's attacks like water flowing around stones. She didn't block his strikes or deflect them, she simply wasn't where they were aimed. Each of the general's devastating attacks found only empty air while Sarah flowed past him with an almost casual indifference to the violence surrounding her. Impossible, Vextheron snarled, spinning to track her movement. No one is that fast. I'm not faster than you, Sarah replied, her breathing barely elevated despite the deadly dance. But speed isn't what matters here. You're fighting against an image of me that exists only in your mind. You're attacking where you think I should be based on your understanding of how combat works. But I've stopped fighting according to those rules. She demonstrated by walking directly toward one of his massive fists, then somehow being behind him when it passed through the space she had occupied. You can't hit what isn't really there, General. And the Sarah you're trying to fight, the scared girl who should be overwhelmed by your size and strength, she doesn't exist anymore. The implications were staggering. Vextheron had spent centuries mastering every known form of combat, studying the fighting styles of hundreds of species, developing strategies to counter every possible opponent. But Sarah Chan Martinez was fighting according to principles that existed outside his entire conceptual framework. Then, show me who you really are. Vextheron roared, abandoning finesse for a berserker assault that filled the arena with the sound of displaced air and striking claws. I can't, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos surrounding her. Because who I really am isn't something that can be shown through violence. It can only be understood through its absence. What followed defied every expectation held by the assembled delegates. The supreme commander of the hegemony war machine, a being who had conquered star systems and broken the will of entire species, found himself completely unable to land a single blow on an unarmed human teenager. More unsettling still, Sarah never attempted to strike back. She flowed around his attacks with an almost supernatural grace, but made no effort to exploit the openings his frustrated assault created. Why don't you fight back? Vextheron demanded during a brief lull in his assault. Because fighting back would make this a contest of violence, Sarah replied. And violence is your strength, not mine. This isn't about proving I can hurt you, General.
It's about proving that I can't be hurt by you.
The psychological impact was devastating.
Every warrior culture in the galaxy was built on the fundamental premise that superior force could overcome any opposition.
Vex Theron represented the apex of that philosophy, the being who had refined violence into an art form and used it to dominate everything in his path. Yet here was someone who seemed to exist in a space beyond the reach of force entirely.
"What are you?"
he whispered, his compound eyes wide with something approaching awe. "I'm what happens when someone stops being afraid of losing," Sarah said. "I'm what emerges when all the weak parts of the self have been burned away."
You wanted to know what strength I possess that you lack? This is it, General. I'm not stronger than you, I'm free of the need to be strong. The arena fell silent as the implications sank in.
Vex Theron, master strategist and supreme warrior, found himself facing an opponent who existed entirely outside his conceptual framework. Every weapon in his arsenal was designed to overcome resistance, but Sarah offered no resistance to overcome. She was like trying to punch smoke or cut water with a sword.
You cannot win through evasion alone, Vex Theron said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. I'm not evading, Sarah replied. I'm demonstrating.
Every second that passes without you defeating me is proof that your kind of strength has limits. Every moment I remain standing is evidence that there are forms of power you can't understand, let alone counter. She gestured to the watching delegates.
Look around you, General.
Every being in this chamber has spent their existence believing that might makes right, that superior force determines survival, that the strong naturally dominate the weak.
But I'm showing them something different.
I'm proving that there's a kind of strength that can't be conquered because it refuses to be conquered.
The truth of her words was evident in the faces, or their equivalent, of the assembled aliens.
Species that had never questioned the fundamental nature of power were witnessing something that challenged their most basic assumptions. Here was proof that the universe operated according to principles they had never imagined. Vex Theron launched himself into one final, desperate assault, pouring every technique and strategy he had mastered into a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm any possible defense. For 30 seconds, the arena became a whirlwind of violence that would have reduced most beings to scattered atoms. When the dust settled, Sarah stood exactly where she had been, completely untouched, while Vex Theron knelt on the arena floor with his forearms trembling from exhaustion.
How? He gasped. Because, Sarah said gently, you're still fighting against something that isn't there.
You're battling an idea of weakness that I abandoned the moment I accepted this challenge. The girl you're trying to defeat, the one who could be intimidated, overwhelmed, or broken, she died when I decided that my people's freedom mattered more than my life. She knelt beside him, bringing herself to his eye level despite the massive size difference.
The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, General.
But the corollary is equally true. The man who clings to his idea of strength will eventually be defeated by someone who has moved beyond the need for strength entirely. Part 2, The Transformation. The silence in the Galactic Council chamber stretched beyond discomfort into something approaching reverence. For nearly 3 hours, the assembled representatives of 400 species had witnessed what could only be described as impossible. Supreme Commander Vex Theron Kolthes, the most feared military strategist in known space, knelt exhausted on the arena floor while a 19-year-old human stood unharmed beside him. But Sarah Chen Martinez was no longer the same person who had walked into the chamber. The transformation that had begun during her meditation had completed itself through the crucible of combat. Where once stood a teenager summoned to an impossible task, there now stood someone who seemed to embody principles that existed beyond the understanding of most beings present. I yield, Vex Theron whispered, the words seeming to tear themselves from his throat. In his species language, the phrase carried implications that the translation matrix struggled to convey, not merely an admission of defeat, but an acknowledgement that his entire worldview had been fundamentally challenged. Sarah remained kneeling beside him.
Do you understand now? I understand.
Vex Theron's compound eyes focused on her with an intensity that made several nearby delegates uncomfortable. That I have been fighting shadows my entire existence. I thought strength meant the ability to impose my will on others. I believed power was measured by what could be conquered or destroyed. But you have shown me something that makes all my victories meaningless.
Not meaningless, Sarah corrected gently. but incomplete. You've mastered one form of power, the ability to overcome external resistance. But there's another form that you've never encountered, the power that comes from having no resistance left to overcome. She stood slowly, and Vextheron found himself rising with her, drawn by something he couldn't name. Around them, the assembled delegates watched with the fascination of beings witnessing the birth of a new philosophical framework. "Tell me," Sarah continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, "what did you feel when you realized you couldn't defeat me?" Vextheron's mandibles clicked in a pattern that xenobiologists would later identify as profound distress. Confusion. Then, frustration. Then, fear. Fear of what? Fear that everything I had built my existence upon was wrong. Fear that all my victories were hollow. Fear that I was... He paused, struggling with concepts his language had never been designed to express, weak. And, in that moment of recognizing your weakness, what happened? The general's response would be studied by philosophers across the galaxy for generations. I became more than I had ever been before. When I stopped trying to be invincible, I discovered something invincible within me. Sarah nodded. That's the paradox, General. The moment we stop fearing our weakness, we become truly strong. The moment we stop clinging to our image of power, we find real power. You've spent centuries building an identity as someone who couldn't be defeated, but that identity was actually your greatest weakness, because it could be threatened. She gestured around the chamber. Every being here has constructed their sense of self around their particular form of strength. The crystalline confederacy believes their perfection lies in their flawless logic. The void swimmers think their superiority comes from their ability to exist between dimensions. The Gossamer Collective finds pride in their telepathic unity. Her words rang through the chamber like tolling bells. But all of these strengths are also weaknesses, because they can be lost. Real strength, the kind that can never be taken away, comes from accepting that all external forms of power are temporary. It comes from finding something within yourself that exists independent of what you can do to others. Ambassador Chen Weilin watched from the human delegation box with an expression of barely contained amazement. She had known her great-granddaughter was remarkable, but this transcended anything she could have imagined. Sarah was not merely winning a challenge, she was fundamentally rewriting the philosophical foundations upon which galactic civilization was built. Delegate Zixtal of the Crystalline Confederacy activated their communication matrix. Young human, your words suggest that our pursuit of logical perfection is flawed? Not flawed, Sarah replied, turning to address the silicon-based entity directly. But incomplete. Logic is a powerful tool, but when you define yourself entirely through your logical perfection, you become vulnerable to anything that threatens that perfection. Your strength becomes your weakness because you fear its loss. The chamber erupted in what could charitably be called controlled chaos. Beings who had never questioned their fundamental assumptions found themselves confronting the possibility that their entire understanding of existence might be built on sand. Through the cacophony, Vextheron's voice cut like a blade, silence. The authority in his tone was absolute, but it carried a different quality than before. Where once his voice had demanded obedience through threat of violence, now it commanded attention through the weight of earned wisdom. This human has done more than defeat me in combat, he announced. She has shown us that our concepts of victory and defeat are themselves limited. We have all been fighting battles that cannot be won because we have been fighting against aspects of ourselves. He turned to Sarah with something approaching reverence. You said that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. But what does it mean to destroy one's weak self? Sarah's answer would become the foundation for a new school of philosophical thought that would spread across the galaxy. It means accepting that everything you think makes you strong, your reputation, your achievements, your abilities, even your identity, are not you. They are things you have accumulated, not who you truly are. The weak self is the part that clings to these accumulations and fears their loss. She began walking slowly around the arena, and somehow her movement drew the attention of every being present with hypnotic intensity. When I sat down to meditate before our combat, I didn't prepare strategies or psych myself up for battle. Instead, I let die everything about myself that could be threatened by this situation. I let go of my fear of failing my people. I released my attachment to living a lone life. I abandoned my need to be seen as capable or worthy. What remained? Asked Delegate Merthal of the Void Swimmers, their shadowy form rippling with curiosity. What remained was something that couldn't be touched by external circumstances. Call it consciousness, call it essence, call it the true self, it doesn't matter what name you give it. What matters is that it exists independent of everything that can be gained or lost. The implications rippled through the chamber like shock waves. Every delegate present represented a species that had built their entire civilization around particular strengths, specific advantages that allowed them to thrive in a competitive galaxy. The suggestion that these very strengths might be limitations was revolutionary. But, surely, interjected High Coordinator Velnas of the Neural Collective, without our distinguishing characteristics, without our particular strengths, we would be nothing? Sarah's smile was gentle but carried the weight of absolute certainty. You would be everything. When you stop limiting yourself to your particular form of strength, you become capable of expressing any form of strength. When you stop defining yourself by your species' characteristics, you become free to embody the best characteristics of all species. To demonstrate, Sarah began moving through the arena in a way that seemed to incorporate elements from dozens of different combat styles. She flowed like a void swimmer, calculated like a crystalline entity, moved with the coordinated precision of the Neural Collective, and demonstrated the raw power potential of hegemony warriors. Yet she was clearly none of these things, she was something beyond categorization. This is impossible, breathed Coordinate Prime Zethkar of the Engineering Guild. No single being can master the essential characteristics of multiple species. Not master, Sarah corrected. Become free of the illusion that mastery is necessary. When you stop trying to be the best at something, you can simply be what the moment requires. When you stop clinging to your particular way of doing things, you can respond to each situation with perfect appropriateness. Vex Theron watched her demonstration with growing understanding. You're not fighting like any particular warrior tradition because you're not fighting at all. You're simply being present to what's happening and responding from a place of perfect freedom. Exactly, Sarah said, coming to rest at the center of the arena. This is what I mean when I say the weak self must be destroyed. The weak self is the part that says I am this but not that, I can do this but not that, I belong here but not there. When those limitations are released, what emerges is limitless. The transformation in the chamber was palpable. Delegates who had entered as representatives of their particular species' interests found themselves contemplating concepts that transcended species entirely. The rigid hierarchies and competitive dynamics that had characterized galactic politics for millennia suddenly seemed not just unnecessary but counterproductive. If what you say is true, Vex Theron said slowly, then our entire approach to civilization has been backwards. We have been building strength through exclusion, defining ourselves by what we are not, what we oppose, what we can dominate. But you suggest strength through inclusion, becoming capable of encompassing everything. I'm suggesting, Sarah replied, that true strength comes from recognizing that the boundaries we draw between self and other, between species and species, between strong and weak, are artificial constructs that limit our potential rather than protecting it. She gestured to encompass the entire assembly. Look around this chamber. You see hundreds of different species, each jealously guarding their particular advantages, each suspicious of the other's motives. But what if instead of seeing competitors and potential threats, you saw different expressions of the same fundamental consciousness that exists in all beings? Delegate Mordain of the Aquatic Federation raised a tentacle. Young human, your philosophy is beautiful in theory, but how does it address practical concerns? How does it handle resource allocation, territorial disputes, conflicting interests? By recognizing that these conflicts exist primarily because we've accepted the illusion of separation, Sarah answered. When you truly understand that the well-being of others is inseparable from your own well-being, resource disputes become opportunities for creative collaboration rather than zero-sum competitions. She began walking among the delegate boxes, and beings that had never allowed non-species members within their atmospheric containment fields found themselves adjusting their fields to allow her passage. You ask about territorial disputes, but territory only matters when you believe you are separate from your environment.
You worry about conflicting interests, but interests only conflict when they arise from the limited perspective of the separate self.
Demonstrate, demanded Vex Theron, his warrior's mind seeking practical application of philosophical concepts.
Sarah paused and considered.
Very well.
General, you initiated this challenge because you believed humanity was taking resources that could be better used by more advanced species. Your perspective was that galactic civilization is a competition where the strongest deserve the most.
Is this accurate? It was, Vex Theron admitted.
And, from that perspective, your challenge made perfect sense. If resources are limited and must be allocated based on merit, then species should prove their worth through demonstrations of strength.
But what if we look at the same situation from a different perspective?
Sarah activated the chamber's holographic display system, creating a three-dimensional map of known galactic civilization.
What if instead of seeing competing species fighting over limited resources, we see complementary aspects of a single, evolving consciousness exploring its own potential through multiple forms?
The hologram shifted, showing resource flows, technological exchanges, and collaborative projects between species. Humanity may be technologically primitive compared to most species here, but we bring something unique, a particular kind of creativity that emerges from our relatively recent evolution. The crystalline confederacy has perfect logic but struggles with intuitive leaps.
Humanity provides that missing element. The display continued evolving, showing how each species' particular strengths could address other species' limitations.
The void swimmers can exist between dimensions but have difficulty with linear time-based planning. The engineering guild excels at building but needs inspiration for what to build. The neural collective can coordinate vast networks but sometimes loses sight of individual perspectives. You're suggesting, said High Coordinator Veleneus slowly, that our differences are not obstacles to overcome but resources to share. I'm suggesting that our differences are how consciousness explores its own infinite potential, Sarah replied. When we compete with each other, we limit ourselves to our particular strengths and remain weak in all other areas. But, when we recognize that all perspectives are valid expressions of the same underlying awareness, we become capable of accessing all strengths.
The implications were staggering.
For millennia, galactic politics had been based on the assumption that different species were fundamentally separate entities with inherently conflicting interests. The entire structure of the Galactic Council existed to manage these conflicts through negotiation, compromise, and, occasionally, force. But Sarah was proposing something entirely different, that the conflicts themselves were based on a misunderstanding of the nature of existence. If all beings were expressions of the same fundamental consciousness, then helping others was literally the same as helping oneself.
This philosophy, said Delegate Zixtal, their crystalline form refracting light in patterns that indicated deep contemplation, would require us to abandon our most basic survival instincts. Competition for resources has driven evolution throughout the galaxy. Has it? Sarah asked. Or has cooperation driven evolution while competition has merely been one of its temporary expressions? Look at your own species, Delegate Zixtal. You achieved consciousness through the cooperation of billions of silicon-based entities. The engineering guild exists because thousands of species chose to share knowledge rather than hoard it. Even the hegemony's military might depend on the willing cooperation of millions of beings. She gestured again to the holographic display. Competition may drive short-term adaptation, but cooperation drives long-term evolution. And what we're talking about here isn't just cooperation between separate entities, it's recognition that separation itself is an illusion. Vex Theron's mandibles clicked in the pattern his species used for deep philosophical consideration. If what you say is true, then every victory I have achieved through conquest has actually made me weaker by cutting me off from the perspectives and abilities of those I defeated. Not weaker, Sarah corrected gently. But less complete. Every being you conquered had something unique to offer, some particular way of experiencing reality that could have expanded your own understanding. By dominating them instead of integrating with them, you limited yourself to your own perspective. The general's compound eyes focused on something beyond the physical chamber. I have conquered 17 star systems and broken the resistance of 43 species.
According to traditional measures, these victories made me the supreme military strategist in known space. But, you're suggesting that if I had instead learned from each of those species, integrated their unique approaches to problem solving, I would have become something far greater than a supreme military strategist.
You would have become a complete being, Sarah confirmed.
Someone capable of addressing any situation from the most appropriate perspective. Someone who could think like a crystalline entity when logic was required, feel like an aquatic when empathy was needed, exist like a void swimmer when transcendence was called for. Part 3, the new paradigm. The transformation that began with Sarah's impossible victory over Vex Theron continued to ripple through the Galactic Council chamber with the inexorable force of a paradigm shift whose time had come. As the young human's words settled into the consciousness of 400 species, something unprecedented began to occur. The artificial barriers that had defined galactic civilization for millennia started to dissolve.
It began subtly.
Delegate Zixtal of the Crystalline Confederacy found their perfectly logical thought patterns spontaneously generating what could only be described as intuitive leaps. High Coordinator Velnas of the Neural Collective experienced, for the first time in their existence, a sense of individual perspective that didn't threaten their connection to the collective mind. Most remarkably, Vex Theron discovered that his warrior's instincts, instead of seeking dominance, were naturally shifting toward protection and integration. "What is happening to us?" whispered Delegate Mordain of the Aquatic Federation, their tentacles trembling with something between excitement and terror. Sarah, still standing at the center of the arena, smiled with the gentle satisfaction of a teacher watching students grasp a fundamental principle. "You're remembering who you really are beneath all the artificial limitations you've constructed around yourselves." "But, these aren't limitations," protested Coordinate Prime Zethkar of the Engineering Guild.
"These are our defining characteristics. Without them, we lose our identity." "Do you?" Sarah asked.
"Or do you discover that your true identity was always larger than any single set of characteristics?"
To demonstrate, she approached Zethkar's delegation box.
The Engineering Guild had evolved on a world where precision and systematic thinking meant survival, and their entire civilization was built around the perfection of technical solutions. They were beings of pure functionality, every aspect of their society designed for optimal efficiency. "Coordinate Prime," Sarah said, "your people have achieved wonders through systematic engineering.
But, tell me, have you ever created something beautiful?" The question seemed to confuse Zethkar.
Their species had concepts of efficiency, functionality, and optimization, but beauty as an independent value was foreign to their thinking.
"Beauty is irrelevant to function." "Is it?" Sarah gestured to the chamber around them.
This space was engineered by a dozen different species working together. From your perspective, you see the efficient use of materials, the optimal acoustic properties, the logical arrangement of delegate boxes.
But, what if you allowed yourself to see it differently?
Something shifted in Zethkar's sensory apparatus. For the first time in their existence, they perceived the chamber not just as a functional space but as an artistic achievement. The way light reflected off polished surfaces, the graceful curves that satisfied both aesthetic and acoustic requirements, the harmonious integration of technologies from hundreds of worlds. Suddenly, it wasn't just efficient, it was magnificent.
"How?"
Zethkar's voice carried tones their species' vocal cords had never produced before.
"How is this possible?"
"Because beauty was always there," Sarah explained.
"You simply learned not to see it."
Your species developed such a focused appreciation for function that you forgot function and beauty aren't opposites, they're different aspects of the same underlying harmony.
The implications were staggering.
If the Engineering Guild could experience aesthetic appreciation without losing their technical abilities, if the Crystalline Confederacy could embrace intuition without abandoning logic, if the Neural Collective could value individual perspectives without fragmenting their unity, then the fundamental assumptions underlying galactic civilization were wrong. "This is dangerous thinking," declared Speaker Torval of the Hierarchical Assembly, their authorization-based society having evolved strict protocols for managing change.
"If beings abandon their defining characteristics, chaos will result. Order depends on predictable behavior patterns."
Sarah turned her attention to the Hierarchical Assembly's delegation. "Speaker Torval, your people have achieved remarkable stability through your authorization systems.
But, has that stability brought you fulfillment?
The question struck at something the speaker had spent centuries avoiding. The hierarchical assembly had indeed achieved perfect order, crime was virtually non-existent, resource distribution was optimally managed, conflicts were resolved through established protocols. But, individual beings within their society reported persistent feelings of emptiness, a sense that life lacked meaning despite its perfect organization. Fulfillment is less important than stability, Torval replied, but their tone suggested the answer felt hollow even to them.
What if they're not opposites? Sarah asked. What if true stability comes not from rigid control but from dynamic balance? What if order that suppresses natural creativity and growth ultimately becomes chaos because it goes against the fundamental nature of consciousness?
She activated the holographic display again, this time showing societal development patterns across multiple civilizations. Look at the data, speaker. Every society that achieves perfect order through rigid control eventually experiences either stagnation or revolution. But, societies that maintain order through dynamic balance, allowing change while preserving essential functions, continue evolving indefinitely.
The pattern was undeniable.
Species after species had followed the same trajectory: initial chaos, gradual organization, rigid systematization, stagnation, and either collapse or transformation. The only societies that had thrived long-term were those that had learned to balance order and creativity, stability and growth. You're suggesting, Torval said slowly, that our pursuit of perfect order has actually made us less stable, not more. I'm suggesting that perfect order is a beautiful goal that becomes destructive when pursued as an end in itself rather than as a means to support the flourishing of consciousness, Sarah replied. True order emerges naturally when beings are free to express their authentic nature. Imposed order requires constant enforcement because it goes against the natural tendency toward growth and evolution. Vex Theron, who had been listening to these exchanges with growing amazement, suddenly understood something that would reshape his entire worldview. You're not describing a new philosophy, he said. You're describing how reality actually works, aren't you? All of our civilizations have been built around fighting against the natural order rather than working with it.
Exactly, Sarah confirmed.
Every species in this chamber has achieved remarkable things, but you've done so by limiting yourselves to particular strengths rather than embracing the full spectrum of possibilities. It's like a master chef deciding to work only with salt. They might become the greatest salt-based cuisine expert in the galaxy, but they're missing the symphony that emerges when all flavors work together. She began moving through the chamber again, and this time delegates found themselves spontaneously adjusting their containment fields not just to allow her passage but to create a kind of flowing pathway that connected every delegation box in the chamber. Without conscious coordination, they were creating a physical manifestation of unity. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, Sarah continued, because the weak self is the part that insists on separation, limitation, and competition. When that illusion is released, what emerges is connected to everything else.
You can't destroy something that is part of everything. Ambassador Chen Weilin watched from the human delegation box with tears streaming down her face.
She had hoped her great-granddaughter might find a way to save humanity from the hegemony's challenge, but what was occurring transcended anything she could have imagined.
Sarah wasn't just saving humanity, she was offering salvation to galactic civilization itself.
The practical question, said Delegate Merthal of the Void Swimmers, is how we integrate this understanding into our existing governmental structures.
The Galactic Council exists to manage conflicts between species with different interests. If those interests are revealed to be artificial constructs, what purpose does the Council serve? Sarah's answer would reshape galactic governance for millennia to come, the same purpose, but approached from the opposite direction.
Instead of managing conflicts between separate entities, you facilitate collaboration between complementary aspects of a unified whole.
She gestured to the assembled delegates. You're already demonstrating this.
Look around the chamber, boundaries between delegations are dissolving without any formal decision to change protocols. Beings are spontaneously sharing atmospheric environments, communication frequencies, even thought patterns. This isn't happening because you've negotiated new treaties or voted on policy changes.
It's happening because you're recognizing your fundamental interconnectedness.
The truth of her words was evident throughout the chamber. The rigid separation between species that had characterized every previous council session was giving way to something that resembled a living organism more than a political assembly. Delegates were still identifiably themselves, crystalline entities remained silicon-based, void swimmers still existed partially between dimensions, aquatic federation members still required water-based environments, but they were no longer isolated within those characteristics. But, surely, protested High Coordinator Velnas, some degree of structure is necessary.
Complete dissolution of boundaries would result in chaos. Would it? Sarah asked. Or would it result in a higher order of organization?
Look at your own neural collective, billions of individual minds maintaining their distinctness while participating in a unified consciousness. That's exactly what I'm describing, but expanded to include all species rather than just your own.
The implications clicked into place with stunning clarity.
The neural collective had achieved something that other species had thought impossible: perfect unity without loss of individual identity. If that model could be extended across species boundaries, the result would be a galactic civilization that maintained all the benefits of diversity while eliminating the costs of separation.
A meta-collective, breathed Velnas.
Not the absorption of all minds into one, but the recognition that all minds are already expressions of one consciousness experiencing itself through multiple perspectives.
Precisely, Sarah confirmed. And the beauty is that this doesn't require anyone to give up what makes them unique.
Crystalline entities can still excel at logic, engineers can still build magnificent structures, warriors can still develop protective strategies. But they do so as expressions of their authentic nature rather than as defenses against other forms of consciousness. Vex Theron's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable to witness. As the understanding penetrated his consciousness, the aggressive stance that had defined his entire existence relaxed into something that could only be described as protective love. His warrior nature remained, but instead of being directed toward conquest, it became focused on safeguarding the growth and evolution of all consciousness. "I understand now," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that his species had never produced before. "I thought strength meant the ability to impose my will on others. But real strength means the ability to protect and nurture the expression of consciousness in all its forms." I wasn't a warrior, I was a gardener who had forgotten that his purpose was to help things grow, not cut them down. The shift in his fundamental nature was so profound that several monitoring devices throughout the chamber registered it as a new life form entering the space. The being who had been Vex Theron the Conqueror was becoming something unprecedented, a warrior whose strength was dedicated entirely to creation rather than destruction. "This transformation," said Delegate Zixtal, their crystalline structure now refracting light in patterns that created rainbow displays throughout their section of the chamber, "feels like remembering something we had forgotten rather than learning something new." "That's because it is," Sarah replied. "Every species in this chamber evolved from the same fundamental consciousness. Your differences aren't divisions, they're specializations. Like different organs in a body, each with a unique function but all serving the same life." She paused at the center of the arena, and, for a moment, the entire chamber fell silent. When she spoke again, her words carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of spacetime itself. "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he becomes invulnerable to external force, but because he realizes that there is no others. There is only one consciousness expressing itself through infinite forms, and, when you know yourself as that consciousness, you become indestructible because you are everything." The silence that followed was not empty but pregnant with possibility. Across the chamber, beings who had spent their entire existence believing they were separate entities struggling for survival in a competitive universe found themselves recognizing their fundamental unity with all life. When Ambassador Chen Weilin finally stood to speak, her voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed a historic transformation. "The challenge issued by General Vex Theron has been met and exceeded. Humanity has not merely proven our worth to remain in the Galactic Council, we have all discovered that worth was never the question. The question was whether we could remember what we truly are." She looked around the chamber at beings who were no longer quite the same species that had entered. "I propose that this council mark this day not as humanity's victory or the hegemony's defeat, but as the beginning of a new age in galactic civilization. An age where our differences become resources for mutual enrichment rather than sources of conflict." Seconded, said Vex Theron, his voice carrying an authority that somehow encompassed rather than dominated. But, more than that, I propose we acknowledge Sarah Chun Martinez not merely as humanity's champion, but as the teacher who reminded us all of what civilization can become when it's built on truth rather than illusion. The vote that followed was unlike any in the Council's history. Instead of a formal process where species voted based on their calculated interests, what occurred was more like a spontaneous recognition of what had already become true. Delegate after delegate stood to express not agreement with a proposal but acknowledgement of a transformation that had already occurred within their own consciousness. As the session concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by beings who wanted to understand how this change could be integrated into their daily lives and governing systems. The questions came from every conceivable perspective, but all carried the same underlying theme: how do we live this truth rather than just intellectually understanding it? The same way you learn to walk, Sarah replied. By taking one step at a time, falling down occasionally, and remembering that the goal isn't perfection but progress. The consciousness that created all of us knows how to express itself through galactic civilization just as surely as it knows how to express itself through individual beings. Trust the process. As delegates began to depart, many lingered to continue conversations that would have been impossible before the day's events. Engineers shared aesthetic visions with artists, warriors discussed protection strategies with healers, logicians explored intuitive insights with mystics. The rigid boundaries that had defined interspecies interaction for millennia were dissolving into something far more fluid and creative. Vex Theron was among the last to leave, and, before departing, he approached Sarah one final time. "I have one last question," he said. "When you destroyed your weak self to become indestructible, did you lose anything that was truly valuable?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I lost the illusion that I was separate from everything else, which felt like losing everything until I realized it meant gaining everything. I lost the fear that I wasn't enough, which felt like losing my motivation until I discovered that love is a much more powerful motivator than fear. I lost the need to prove my worth, which felt like losing my identity until I found my real identity in the worthiness that was always there." She smiled. "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but neither can he be separated from others. That's the real transformation, not becoming invulnerable, but becoming indivisibly connected to all life." As the great chamber finally emptied, Sarah stood alone in the arena where it had all begun. The girl who had entered as humanity's unlikely champion was gone, dissolved in the crucible of truth. What remained was someone who belonged not to any single species but to consciousness itself, a living reminder that the boundaries between self and other, strong and weak, victor and vanquished, were always and only constructs of the limited mind. The challenge that had begun as a test of humanity's right to exist among advanced civilizations had become something far greater, a demonstration that civilization itself could evolve beyond the primitive dynamics of competition and domination into something worthy of consciousness in all its magnificent forms. And, in that transformation, every being present had discovered what it truly meant to be indestructible, not to be beyond the reach of change, but to be the very source of all change, the eternal awareness within which all experiences arise and pass away, forever unchanged by the very changes it makes possible. The weak self that fears destruction was revealed as the greatest illusion consciousness had ever created. And, in the dissolution of that illusion, what emerged was not just individual liberation but the possibility of a civilization based on the recognition that consciousness and cosmos are one indivisible whole, expressing itself through the beautiful dance of diversity and unity that had always been the deepest truth of existence.